Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Encounter at Farpoint, which is episode 1 of season 1 of Star Trek Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my user polls. The episode to win my user poll for the Next Generation, the most recent user poll that is, was the pilot episode of the entire show, Encounter at Farpoint. So Encounter at Farpoint is the episode when Picard takes command of the Enterprise D and on a mission to Farpoint Station to investigate the strange alien outpost there. They're encountered the omniscient being Q, who puts humanity on trial and uses the Farpoint mission as a test. So Picard goes to Farpoint, where they discover the strange things are happening, whatever anyone wants seems to materialize out of thin air, and then an space alien creature approaches the planet and fires on the people who built Farpoint Station, not Farpoint itself. And then Q kind of taunts Picard and tries to get them to attack the aliens, but Picard deduces that the people, the Bandai at Farpoint, had captured the other space alien and used it to become Farpoint Station, and its mate was upset, and that's why it attacked the builders. And so Picard gives Farpoint Station enough energy in order for it to leave the planet and join its mate, and thus they pass Q's test. So I don't know. I want to say that most people agree that this is not a good episode. I've heard a lot of opinions saying that this was the worst pilot episode of all of Star Trek. I would say it's the second worst. I would put Enterprises behind this. I don't know, some people like that, but I really don't like that. But anyway, it is definitely one of the worst pilots of Star Trek. Yet I've heard other people have a soft spot for this episode. Some opinions out there really like this episode. They watch, what's it called? Watch Mojo or whatever it's called, .com. They do all their top 10 videos. They did a top 10 best episodes of Star Trek Next Generation, and this episode made the list. Now bear in mind, for that website, their top 10s are voted upon by their users. So enough users voted. This episode has one of the 10 best episodes of Star Trek Next Generation. I just think that's absolutely ludicrous. I mean, people must just really like the fact that this is the first episode. This first episode is a disaster. Now, apparently, I was reading up a bit on Star Trek Next Generation, how it was formed. Apparently, the Paramount Studios, after a success of Star Trek 4, or Star Trek 2, Star Trek 3, then Star Trek 4, which Star Trek 4 made them a lot of money, they decided to make another Star Trek show. And because William Shatner and all the original series cast were too expensive for TV, they decided to have set it 100 years in the future. But when Gene Roddenberry found out about this, he was pissed off, and it was like, wait a second, I still own the rights. You can't do this without me. So they were like, okay, why don't you do it then? And apparently he was not prepared to do it, and thus it kind of resulted in the first season of Next Generation had a lot of behind the scenes problems. The writer's room was seen as it was described as a war zone, with people quitting left and right, or getting fired left and right. And so you see that it had a lot of production issues, and I think those production issues is very relevant in this pilot episode. And also, they had an ridiculously low budget. which is never a really good thing for a sci-fi show like this. So I think there is a strong foundation here, and I talked about that before, that there was a strong enough foundation with these characters that the Next Generation became one of the greatest shows ever made later on. But it was off to a rough start, and I think this pilot episode was a particularly rough start indeed. I don't think it's a particularly good episode. I think a lot of the characters that work later in the show, not just the main characters, but some of the guest characters like Q, they don't work in this episode. So it's like a testament to what the writers who came later on managed to pull, and this was a gradual process that you see happen over several years, even with Q, that they slowly managed to make these characters really interesting and the setting interesting. But here at the moment, it seems obvious that they really weren't prepared. In fact, the original script for this episode was quite different and took place entirely on Farpoint Station, and it was under time, so they brought in Gene Roddenberry to fill out the time, and he came up with the idea of Q, which a lot of people were opposed to, because a lot of people were like, it's just Trelane done again, which is interesting because I've actually heard of Q before I heard of Trelane myself. So when I saw Trelane, I was like, hey, it's Q. So it kind of makes sense to me that would be the reaction. And really, the kind of, especially the way Q is portrayed in this episode, reminds me a lot of the original series. And it is like the more cheesier side, I believe, that I believe has the Gene Roddenberry influence on it, where they encounter all these god-like creatures with like omniscient powers. It happens so much in the original series. It's like, oh, I am this god creature, or like they actually encounter Apollo, a hand floating in space, or Abraham Lincoln floating in space, and all these like ridiculously god-like creatures. Not just Trelane, although this was the one. Trelane was most similar to Q in demeanor. So it was just a Roddenberry thing, which I don't. It's something I don't really like about the original series, and I don't think it works well in this episode. Now, as I said, they actually managed to turn Q into a really interesting character later on. Mostly by going a bit more comedic with this character, although they kind of tie it back together with the final episode of the show, All Good Things, where he becomes a bit more dramatic, but they still totally change his character, where he's not such a straight out villain, where it's like, oh, humanity, blah, blah. He's a bit jocular in this episode too, but mainly from a more antagonistic standpoint. It's like, oh, you humans are savages. Which again is very Roddenberry-esque. I think they do something, play him very differently. In fact, I can't help while I'm watching this episode to think about All Good Things, where they revisit this episode, but they change the events. And it's just, they actually make this episode good. Like, Q is portrayed so much better in that episode. They just really, really came a long way. And it's just a lot of like the situations it's like, particularly the way Q is portrayed in this episode, and the way that the alien space station turns out to be an alien creature. I mean, there's two giant jellyfish, fly into space and they fly away, the happy couple. It's just over the top ridiculous. It's just a bit too fantastical, which again, the original series did go a little bit more fantastical, but it's not in keeping with what Next Generation became. And I think Next Generation became such a better show because they moved away from this kind of storytelling. So it is a bit strange in retrospect to go back and watch this as the very first episode, because it's not actually entirely representative of what the show is going to become, which is a good thing, because if this pilot episode was representative of what Next Generation would become, then it would not be a good show. So in that case, it's not a very good pilot, because the pilots usually are supposed to represent what the show is going to be like. And as I said, it's a good thing that this doesn't, because it's as I said, it was two different scripts like plucked together, and it's very obvious. It's very obvious how they try to fit the Q scenes into the Farpoint storyline, and I love how Q talks about, oh, this Farpoint mission will be a good test indeed. You are not prepared for the dangers that await you. And it's just like, it's not that big of a deal. They just go there, and it's fucking obvious that Groppler Zorn is hiding something, and they use Troy's telepathic or empathic abilities to figure out that there's an alien creature there. What's so dangerous about that? And it seems like it's such an easy mission to solve. and Q is like, he tries to egg them on. He tries to get them to like attack the creatures and whatnot. It's like a child saying, "Go ahead, go on, lose," like trying to poke you while you're like playing a game or something, or you're setting something up like Jenga or something, and a child sitting there poking at you, trying to distract you. Go on, lose, and it seems like that's what Q's purpose in this episode is, where it's such an easy task for Picard and crew to solve, and Q tries to make, come on Picard, fail, come on, fuck up, woo, let me distract you. And it's ridiculous. It is out now, and I gotta say, the dialogue it's a bit cringy watching this episode, because the dialogue is so poorly written, like particularly scenes where you have they bring up like background character information, exposition, like out of nowhere. That's like so out of place. Now, the Deep Space Nine pilot's very infamous for doing this with Odo, which I think is probably the worst example in all of Star Trek. But this episode is pretty bad too. The way Crusher, brings up the fact that that Picard last saw Wesley when he told him about his dead father. And it's like, you remember you saw him before last time when he's like, yes, I remember. Like that, why would she say that? Like that's just so out of place, and it seems like so exposition-y. And it's like the whole thing where they're going over LaForge's visor so they can explain to the audience what his visor is. And, they try to excuse this by LaForge being like, yes, I heard this all before. And it's all in the name that he's suffering from chronic pain, but Crusher gives him two options. He's like, both options would damage the effectiveness of the visor. And he refuses. Well, if you heard that before, then why is he seeing her again? And they never mention this chronic pain ever again, and that does seem like a huge deal, actually, that someone, I couldn't imagine living with chronic pain like that. I mean, honestly, like, I'd rather damage the effectiveness of the visor. But so that was just, it's never acknowledged again, because it doesn't really exist. It was just there for, so they could explain what the visor is. And the whole, there's some other examples. Oh, Tasha Yar, that was like the worst example, where during the trial, just out of nowhere, she's like, you don't understand, Q, you don't deserve these people, help me out of a tough situation, you should get on your knees as to what Starfleet represents. And it's just like, that is such cheesy, terrible writing that is so out of place that it's just terrible. Now, the one thing, exposition sort of background thingy, or the two, actually there's a couple that I got right, because I think Data they actually did right, because they didn't have Data all of a sudden be like, oh, guess what? I'm an android, and I was created by Soon, and blah, blah, blah. Like, they, like, slowly, like, fed it into dialogue. Like, at the start, it was really subtle, but then later, when they had the scenes with McCoy, and then the scenes with Riker in the holodeck, they sort of expanded upon it a bit more. So that actually worked. They actually did explain Data pretty well. And the Riker and Troy thing, they also explained that pretty well. That scene with them made sense, except for the fact that wouldn't they know, like, wouldn't Riker know that Troy was assigned to the Enterprise and vice versa? I mean, maybe they did, because they never said they didn't know. So maybe they were still, they knew intellectually that they would have to see each other. Just seeing each other seeing each other again was more sort of emotionally shocking than they expected, even though they knew it was coming. Well, that I could buy. So I could buy that to an extent. Although in All Good Things, Troy told Picard in advance that she had a prior relationship with Riker, whereas in this episode, Picard was clearly oblivious. In fact, he was stupidly oblivious. You could say, oh, Picard's just putting on an act. He knows. I don't buy that. He's not putting on an act. It's obvious that he's just fucking oblivious. He has no idea that when these two are just staring at each other, being, oh my God. And he's just like, oh, you two know each other. Oh, that's great. It's good for my officers to know each other. He's like, how more oblivious could you possibly get? And to be fair to the All Good Things thing, that was actually a different sort of timeline that was well established, that actually didn't really take place. So, I mean, but if Troy told him in that timeline, why didn't she tell him in this timeline? Maybe Q interrupted? I don't know. But anyway, it's not just people that they gave really terrible exposition to, it's also technology. Like the whole saucer separation thing, it was totally pointless. Like, there was no reason to do that. Like the whole like ship chase scene with Q, where he turned into this giant ball that in space that was chasing him. Like, he has omniscient powers. Why is he doing this? And why is Picard actually chasing it? Like, they go to warp 9.8, of course, to establish what speed they can go to. The actual chase scene made zero sense. And the whole let's separate the saucer. Like, they were going to establish that whenever the Enterprise D goes into battle, they can separate the saucer, so all the civilians and the kids and whatnot can go to safety, while the star drive section goes off to fight their battles. But the huge problem with that is the saucer section does not have warp drive. Therefore, it's a sitting duck. It's putting all their civilians on this like giant defenseless target that anyone can come by and destroy. So it's a terrible system. And that's why they never use it again. And they made such a big deal with the saucer separation too. It was like da 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 da, show the ship separate. Last 5 minutes and it's really boring. And they have like Riker, Picard's like, Riker, you gotta put the ship back together and do it manually. Woo! And Riker goes on the battle bridge and he's like, okay, we're gonna reconnect with the saucer section and we're gonna do it manually. And Data's like, what? You mean no automation whatsoever? And Riker's like, that's right, that's what we're ordered. And so they're all tense and like, oh my god. And it goes back together, of course. No incident, and everyone's like, whew, thank God. And Picard's like, you handled that nicely, number one. Well, okay, so I got a question here. Excuse me, what does God need with the star? No, I got a different question. Here's my question. If this is so difficult and so dangerous and everyone's so freaked out about it, why the fuck did Picard order him to do that? Like, what was the point of it? I mean, I think the show is trying to tell us it's Picard's way of testing Riker to make sure that he has what it takes. But if it's really that dangerous and people are really that freaked out about it, it seems like he's putting the ship at risk for no good goddamn reason. I mean, sure, Riker it proves that Riker is capable, but what if he wasn't capable? What if the ship crashed and it caused damage to this massive starship, or maybe some people could have gotten hurt? But Picard's way of testing. I mean, it's fake stakes. They were never, of course, in really danger, but it was just the whole way they were acting. Like, oh my god, wow, no automation. It was trying to bring tension to what was a pointless and boring scene. And yes, as I mentioned, the whole saucer separation thing, it was only used, I believe, 2 more times in the show entirely. Once was Arsenal of Freedom, which is later in the first season, where they actually did use it for what it was meant to be used, where they send the civilians to fuck off. And in this case, it did make sense because the danger was specifically localized on this one planet, so they could shoot the saucer section out into space and away from the planet, and it'll be fine. So that was the one example where it was actually worked, was actually applicable. And the other example where they used the saucer separation was the Best of Both Worlds Part 2, but that was part of a battle tactic. They weren't sending the civilians, they weren't separating to keep the civilians safe from the saucer section. They were actually using the saucer section as a distraction during battle tactics, so that's something entirely different. I guess you could also say the other example is Star Trek Generations, but that was used as a sort of evacuation where the ship was being destroyed, where they evacuated everyone to the saucer section so it could land on the planet. This is something that actually had been established through the supplemental material, like the technical manual and stuff, as being a purpose of the saucer section, that if in case of a warp core breach, they could evacuate to the saucer section, separate the ship so everyone could survive while the star drive section explodes. And that makes total sense. So I actually agree with it from that standpoint, but from the standpoint of having a battle bridge where they send all the civilians off in this defenseless saucer section that does not have warp drive, that's bullshit. That is a terrible tactic, and absolutely why they completely forgot about it, other than those 3 examples I gave, and never used it ever again. and future shows didn't do bullshit like this either, because it's just ridiculous. But they make such a big deal out of it in this episode. And the way they introduced the holodeck was really kind of clunky too, as well. It's interesting because as I noted after watching the animated series more recently, that they actually had a holodeck. They called it the Rec Room in an episode of the animated series. So this has already been invented, but here they sort of they took that same idea, but it was like, fuck the animated series, that's not really canon. But later on, CBS decreed it was. But anyway, they're like, nah, it's not canon. Let's just say that this is the first use of the holodeck here and now. And so Wesley and Data and Riker are all acting like they'd never seen a holodeck before. It's like, wow, look at this new technology. Isn't this amazing? And mind you, in this episode alone, it's just a location setting. They didn't actually introduce the concept of hologram people, holodeck people, that they could create whole scenarios with characters who are alive until, I believe, the Big Goodbye is when they first introduced that concept. So in this situation, it's just like scenery. And yeah, so the way, and why was Data, it seems like there was no reason for them to be in the holodeck. Data was just hanging out by a tree and whistling for no reason, and Wesley was walking around Data's program for no reason. And there was that rock that was loose that Wesley fell in the water. Like, why didn't he just program the rock to not be loose? I don't. It seemed completely, totally unnecessary. But actually, I'm going to take back what I said about Data, because I actually think some of the exposition here about Data being an android was a bit awkward. But it wasn't anywhere near as bad as the Tasha Yar stuff. You should be down on your knees to what the Federation represents. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? Oh yeah, and Worf, like, there's a couple times where Worf is like, I'm a Klingon, sir, I need to go into battle. And, like, this is not realistic exposition. Alright, so I will say, I mean, there's, as I said, there's some good aspects to this episode, like the whole actually Troy I thought was decent in this episode. I thought her whole she actually has powers. This is something they're totally inconsistent about for the rest of the show, but at least in this episode she's used well, where she can sense the pain of the creature but not exactly why, and she can tell that Groppler Zorn is lying. Now Groppler Zorn, hey, he's a funny little guy, isn't he? Like, you know, it's funny. There's the scene where he's like captured by the alien jellyfish thingy, and he's being like tortured, and he's suspended in this force field, and he goes, "Make it stop! The pain! Make it stop!" Well, he is a bit dramatic and over the top, isn't he? And to be honest, like, this is something whenever I got really sick, and I was having really strong pains, and I was like in extreme pain, I would sometimes say that. I would like quote this episode, "Make it stop the pain." It's sort of a way to amuse myself and try to distract myself from all the pain I was in. But anyway, make it stop. Groppler Zorn. Groppler Zorn. You will be missed. Not really. So, yeah, I mean, it was pretty fucking obvious that Groppler Zorn, that something was going on with him. And when they, you know, Troy is like, "Oh, I hear all this pain." It's like, yes, they captured a creature and turned it into the station. I mean, and it's also obvious the fact he was dodging when Picard's like, "Oh, can you build those other stations?" And he's like, "No." "Well, maybe you can lend some engineers and they can give us some technical specs to help so we can build other stations." He's like, "No." It's like, come on. He's captured an alien and turned into a space station. So obvious. I mean, not just that. I mean, when they get more evidence, whatever. But it kind of took them a bit too long to figure this one out. And, ooh, what a huge mystery. You have no idea the mystery that awaits you. Woo. The one thing I will agree with Picard with, and I think it was this episode, at the end of this episode, where someone says, "Oh, would all our adventures be this exciting?" And Picard's like, "Nah, I'm sure our other adventures will be way more interesting than this." And hit the nail on the head on that one, Pickard. Anyway, so yeah, I didn't care for this episode. It didn't completely and totally suck, but it was a terrible. Oh, one more thing before I go. McCoy, Leonard McCoy, Leonard McCoy. He has a brief appearance where he's 138 or whatever. Why was he on the Enterprise? Like, this whole point is like, oh, you know, Riker wanted to see Data, and Worf or whoever was like, no, Data's busy. He's taking some admiral dignitary on the shuttle over to the hood. And it's like, oh, why doesn't he just beam over? Because the admiral's special. Okay, so, but why was McCoy on the Enterprise? Was McCoy on the Enterprise the whole time during all this bullshit with Q? Or, and if he was, why was he there for their maiden voyage? Or did the Enterprise pick him up at Farpoint? And if they picked him up at Farpoint, why did they pick him up at Farpoint? Why didn't he just beam or shuttle directly over to the hood? Why did he go to the Enterprise first and then go to the hood? What was his business there? What was he doing there? Why is he there? There's absolutely no reason for him to be there. None. They could have. I know they wanted to have a McCoy cameo, but come on. do a better job of explaining why he's there. It's just like, oh, he's there, but just because so we can have McCoy be like, hey, you look like a Vulcan, boy. Like, he was playing a really over the top to his whole. But anyway, my rating for Encounter at Farpoint out of 10 is a 3. Very poor. Mind you, it's not a 2 or a 1 because there's some good aspects to this episode. As I said, the Gropper Zorn stuff with God, guy's so silly, but it is somewhat interesting. And the fact that the alien jellyfish and some of the character interactions do work, like between Riker and Troy and whatnot. But most of it is just really terrible exposition. Poorly written dialogue. The Q storyline was silly, and it's actually really testament to the future writers that they made Q an interesting character, because he was not an interesting character. I mean, I can see there's nuggets of promise, and they sort of latched on to that and expanded upon that and sort of ignored most of the crap that made this character suck in this episode. But the whole idea of like this powerful being, oh, we're going to spend a spaceship after you and go into like a chase where he's against an omniscient being who can do anything he wants and instantly materialize wherever he wants. Why are you chasing? Why are you firing torpedoes at it? It makes no sense. It makes no sense. Anyway, and as I said, the whole mystery, what a big mystery, is that not that big of a deal, and they should have actually figured it out way quicker than they did. Anyway, that's it for my review of Encounter at Farpoint. I shall return to review more episodes of Star Trek, as well as cover many other shows, such as The Expanse, Breaking Bad, The Outer Limits, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.